Chapter 1. The Dawn of a Scream. The palace corridor is silent, except for the sound of bare feet dragging across cold marble. A young prince, barely 17, stumbles forward, held by two mute executioners dressed in black. His wrists are bound, his eyes are wide, searching the shadows for a face he recognizes, for mercy, for his mother, for anyone, but the palace has already turned its back. Behind a lattice screen, a figure watches, unmoved, unblinking. It is his brother, the sultan, the one who ordered this. The executioners stop at a door carved with verses from the Quran. Inside, the room is small. There are no windows, no witnesses, only a single stool, a silk cord, and the smell of incense masking something dark, a fierce sweat, and the faint trace of blood from the prince who was brought here last week. The young man's knees buckle. He tries to speak, to beg, to ask why, but his voice cracks into a whisper. The executioners do not respond. They were chosen because they cannot hear, they cannot speak. They are the sultan's perfect instruments. One of them unrolls a braided bowstring, smooth, strong, and silent. No blade, no blood, no scandal. The prince is forced onto the stool. His breath comes in ragged gasps. He closes his eyes, and in that final moment, he remembers his childhood, playing in the gardens with the brother who now orders his death, laughing, innocent, unaware that their love was always temporary, that the throne would one day demand a choice. Power or family? The cord tightens. Within seconds it is over. The body is wrapped in silk and carried through a hidden passageway. By dawn, the palace will speak of him in past tense. If they speak of him at all, his name will be struck from official records, his belongings burned, his existence erased as cleanly as his breath. This is not an anomaly, not a tragic accident, not even a secret. This is law, this is tradition, this is the Ottoman Empire. For over 3 centuries, the most powerful dynasty in the world maintained its throne, not by defeating enemies, but by killing its own sons, brothers, strangled brothers, fathers, ordered the executions of infants, mothers, watched their children murdered in corridors they once played in, and it all began with a single terrifying sentence written into imperial decree. Whichever of my sons inherits the sultanate, it is fitting that he kill his brothers to preserve the order of the world. This was not the work of a single tyrant. It was policy, it was inheritance, it was survival. But how does a civilization, a religion, a culture that preaches family and unity build an empire on the corpses of its own children? How did fratricide become not a crime but a duty? And what happened to the men and the boys who lived under this law, knowing that their brother's first breath as sultan would be their last? The answers lay buried in the blood-soaked halls of Topkapi Palace, in the whispers of traumatized servants, in the journals of foreign ambassadors who watched in horror as the Ottoman throne devoured its heirs one by one. This is not a story of monsters. This is a story of a system so ruthless, so calculated, that it turned love into liability and family into fatal risk. And it begins long before that silent room, long before the bowstring, long before the scream that no one was allowed to hear. It begins with an empire that learned one lesson too well. Power is safer when it stands alone. Chapter 2. A dynasty born in fire. The year is 1362. The Ottoman Empire is still young, a rising power clawing its way across Anatolia and into the Balkans. It is not yet the titan that will conquer Constantinople, not yet the shadow that will stretch across 3 continents, but it is learning, and one of its cruelest lessons is about to be written in blood. Sultan Murad I sits on his throne victorious. After years of brutal expansion, his armies are fierce, his strategies are cunning. But his greatest enemy is not the Byzantines or the Serbs, it is his own sons, because in the early years of the dynasty's succession was chaos. When a sultan died, his sons did not wait for diplomats or councils to decide the future. They raised armies, they rallied loyalists, they marched on each other with swords drawn. And Banner's high civil war was the inheritance. Murad I himself had seen it, his own father's death, followed by violent struggles between brothers, cousins, uncles. The empire nearly collapsed before it could even solidify. And Murad understood something that would haunt Ottoman history for centuries. A throne divided is a throne destroyed, so he made a choice after a particularly bloody campaign. Murad's son Asavisi Bey grew impatient. He didn't want to wait for his father's death to claim power. He rebelled, gathering his own forces and challenging the Sultan directly. It was the first time an Ottoman prince openly betrayed his father. Murad crushed the rebellion. But instead of exile or imprisonment, he made an example that would echo through generations. Asavisi Bey was executed not in secret, not quietly. He was strangled in front of the army, his body displayed as a warning. The message was clear: even blood does not protect you from treason. But Murad went further. Before his death, he reportedly gave his blessing to a twisted new policy, one that his son Bayezid I would later codify into law to prevent civil war. The Sultan must eliminate all rival claimants, even his brothers, even his sons. It was a doctrine born from pragmatism, not cruelty. The empire had grown too large, too valuable, too fragile to risk fracturing every generation. If the price of stability was a few royal deaths, so be it. And so fratricide became law. By the time Mehmed the Conqueror rewrote the legal codes in the 15th century, the policy was explicit: whichever of my sons inherits the sultanate, it is fitting that he kill his brothers to preserve the order of the world. Most jurists have approved this. Let them henceforth act accordingly. It was no longer a shameful necessity, it was a sacred duty. Foreign ambassadors were horrified. European courts whispered about the barbarism of the Ottomans, conveniently ignoring their own histories of poisoned crowns and assassinated heirs. But for the Ottomans this was logic, cold, ruthless, and devastatingly effective. No more civil wars. No more fracturing, no more armies tearing the empire apart from within. Just a single ruler and a palace full of ghosts. Of course, this created a new kind of terror, because once the law was written, every prince born into the dynasty knew one undeniable truth: your brothers are not your family, they are your executioners in waiting, and you are theirs. From the moment they could walk, royal sons were taught to see each other not as siblings, but as threats. Mothers stopped letting their children play together. Princes were separated into different wings of the palace. Trust became a luxury no one could afford. The empire had found a way to prevent civil wars, but it had created something far darker: a dynasty where childhood was a countdown, where every birthday brought you closer to either a throne or a grave. And the question that haunted every young prince as he lay awake in his gilded chambers was not if his brother would try to kill him. It was when. Chapter 3: Childhood in Chains. Imagine being 5 years old and knowing that your brother is your enemy, not because of a fight, not because of jealousy, but because the law says so. This was the reality for every Ottoman prince born after the 15th century. They grew up in paradise and in prison. The palace was vast, filled with gardens and fountains, silk cushions and golden chandeliers. Servants attended to every need. Tutors taught them languages, poetry, warfare and statecraft. But beneath the luxury was a suffocating truth. You were being prepared either to rule or to die, and you wouldn't know which until it was too late. As boys, the princes were kept apart: separate quarters, separate tutors, separate lives. Their mothers' concubines, elevated to positions of influence, became their only allies, their only protectors, and those mothers knew that their survival depended entirely on their sons. If your son became sultan, you became the most powerful woman in the empire. If your son was executed, you were forgotten or worse. So the palace became a chessboard of whispered alliances and silent betrayals. Mothers spied on each other, servants reported conversations, princes learned to speak in coded language, to trust no one, to see threats in every shadow. And then there was the cafes, the cage. By the early 17th century, the Ottomans had refined their cruelty. Instead of executing princes immediately upon a new sultan's rise, they locked them away. The cafes was a suite of rooms deep within Topkapi Palace, luxurious in appearance, but suffocating in function. Princes were confined there for years, sometimes decades, watched constantly, never allowed to leave, never allowed to govern or learn statecraft. They were given concubines who were secretly sterilized, ensuring no heirs could be born. They were surrounded by servants who reported their every word. Some were given books, others nothing. It was a living tomb, and it broke them. Princes who entered the cafes as teenagers emerged, if they emerged at all, as paranoid, unstable, sometimes mad. They had no experience ruling, no understanding of the world outside, no relationships, except with those who were paid to surveil them. When one of these men finally ascended the throne, often because every other heir had died, they were shadows of what a sultan should be. Some, like Ibrahim I, descended into madness. He reportedly drowned 280 concubines in a single night out of paranoia. Others became puppets controlled by viziers and generals who saw opportunity in their weakness. The cafes was supposed to be mercy, a way to avoid the bowstring, but in truth it was just a slower death, because even if your body survived, your mind didn't. And for the princes who were never locked away, those who remained free within the palace, the psychological torture was just as real. You watched your brothers disappear one by one. You heard the rumors. You saw your mother weep in secret. You learned that asking questions was dangerous, so you stayed silent. You smiled at feasts. You played the part of the loyal prince. And every night you lay awake wondering, will I wake up tomorrow? Will they come for me tonight? Is that footstep in the hall a servant or an executioner? This was not a childhood, it was a countdown, and the clock was always ticking. Some princes tried to rebel, to flee, to beg for exile, but the system had no exits. You were born into the dynasty, and you would die by its rules. The only question was whether your death would be recorded or erased entirely, as if you had never existed at all. Chapter 4. The seeds of paranoia. Power does not breed loyalty, it breeds suspicion. And nowhere was this more true than in the Ottoman palace, where every smile concealed a motive, and every conversation could be a trap. By the time a prince reached adolescence, the palace had transformed into a silent war zone, because it wasn't just brothers watching each other. It was mothers, viziers, generals, eunuchs, servants, foreign ambassadors, even the sultan, his own advisors, calculating which prince to support, which to undermine, and which to quietly eliminate. Before they became a threat, the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, was often the most powerful woman in the empire. But the mothers of younger princes, they lived in constant fear. They knew that their sons were expendable, that any sign of ambition, any whisper of conspiracy could doom them. So they played the game. They formed alliances with influential viziers. They bribed palace guards. They spread rumors about rival princes, whispers of disloyalty, of forbidden meetings, of treasonous thoughts. Sometimes the rumors were true, often they were not. But truth didn't matter, perception did. And once a sultan began to suspect a brother, the brother was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. The palace archives are filled with cases of princes accused of plotting rebellion. Some were genuine conspiracies, desperate attempts to escape the cafes, or to seize power before a brother could strike first, but many were fabrications. A rival mother planting evidence, a vizier eliminating a prince who refused to be controlled, a sultan driven mad by paranoia, seeing enemies in every corner. Take Prince Mustafa, son of Suleiman. The magnificent Mustafa was beloved by the army, by the people, even by his father. He was capable, charismatic, and everything a sultan should be, but that made him dangerous. Suleiman's wife, Harem Sultan, formerly a concubine, now the most powerful woman in the empire, had her own sons, and as long as Mustafa lived, her children would never be safe. So she began to plant doubts. Whispers reached Suleiman's ears. Mustafa is too popular. The army loves him more than you. He is gathering support. He is planning to overthrow you. Was it true? Perhaps, perhaps not. But Suleiman couldn't take the risk. In 1553, Mustafa was summoned to his father's campaign tent. He entered expecting a military briefing. Instead, he found execution as he tried to fight, tried to plead, tried to reach his father, who watched from behind a curtain as his son was strangled. Mustafa died calling out for Suleiman. Suleiman never responded. The execution shattered the empire. The army nearly mutinied. The people. One foreign court spoke of Suleiman's cruelty for decades, but Harem's sons were safe, and that was all that mattered. This was the reality of Ottoman succession. It wasn't enough to be innocent. You had to be invisible. Any sign of competence, ambition, or popularity was a death sentence. Because the system didn't just reward cruelty, it required it. A sultan who hesitated, who showed mercy, who tried to spare his brothers was seen as weak, and weakness invited rebellion. So they killed preemptively. They killed based on rumors. They killed to send a message, and sometimes they killed simply because it was easier than living in fear. The tragedy was that many of these princes were not rebels. They were not traitors. They were just boys who wanted to survive. But survival wasn't an option. You were either sultan or you were dead. And so the cycle continued, generation after generation, sultan after sultan, each one inheriting not just a throne, but a mandate to destroy his own family. Each one knowing that the moment his son was born, he was creating his own future executioner or victim. The question was no longer if the bloodshed would come, it was only how many would die this time. And in 1595, the world would get its answer, because one sultan was about to redefine the scale of fratricide, and the empire would never be the same. Chapter 5: The Night of Betrayal. January 1595. Sultan Murad III is dead. The palace moves quickly. His body is still warm when the executioners are summoned, because Murad left behind 19 sons, and his now M3 knows the law, knows the risk, knows that if even one of his brothers survives, his reign will be haunted by conspiracy, rebellion, and civil war. So he makes the decision that will define his legacy. He orders them all killed, every single one. Some of the princes are teenagers, some are children, some are infants barely able to walk, let alone threaten a throne. It doesn't matter, the law is clear. The executioners enter the harem at night, silently, efficiently. They carry no weapons that clang or clash, only the silk bowstrings that leave no blood, no mess, no scandal. The mothers wake to the sound of footsteps. They scream, they beg, they throw themselves at the executioners, trying to shield their sons. But the executioners are deaf mutes, chosen specifically so they cannot be swayed by pleas or bribed with promises. They do not hesitate. One by one the princes are strangled. Some die quickly, others struggle, their small hands clawing at the cords. The mothers are held back by guards, forced to watch as their sons are murdered in front of them. By dawn, 19 bodies are laid out in a row, 19 silk wrapped bundles, 19 heirs erased in a single night. The youngest was barely 2 years old, the eldest was only 20. None of them had committed a crime, none had plotted treason. Their only offense was being born. M3 watches from a distance. His face is blank, unreadable. Later historians will argue whether he felt guilt, whether he wept in private, whether he justified it as duty, or whether it haunted him for the rest of his life. But in that moment, he does what every sultan before him has done. He buries his humanity beneath the weight of the crown, because this is not personal. This is survival. The bodies are carried to the imperial cemetery and buried without ceremony. Their graves are unmarked. Their names are stricken from official records. The palace servants are warned. Speak of this night and you will join them. Foreign ambassadors, however, are not so easily silenced. Reports flood back to Europe. The Venetian envoy writes of unimaginable horror. The French ambassador calls it a massacre of innocents. Across Christendom the story spreads. The Ottoman Sultan, who murdered his own infant brothers to secure power. The empire's enemies use it as propaganda. The Ottomans, they say, are savages, barbarians, a civilization built on fratricide and fear. But within the empire, the reaction is more complicated. Some officials praise Mehmed's decisiveness. They point to the civil wars of earlier dynasties, the bloodshed that tore the empire apart when succession was unclear. Better 19 deaths now, they argue, the 19 rebellions later. Others are silent, traumatized, unable to reconcile the law they served with the carnage they witnessed. And the mothers, The mothers are never the same. Some go mad, some retreat into silence, spending the rest of their lives in isolated chambers staring at walls. One, it is said, throws herself from a palace window. Another writes a letter to her sister smuggled out by a sympathetic servant. They killed my son in front of me. He was 7 years old. He cried for me. I could not save him. I do not know how to live in a world where this is law. The letter is discovered. The servant is executed. The mother disappears from the records entirely, but the trauma lingers because this was not just the murder of princes, it was the murder of the future, of potential, of possibility, of boys who might have been poets, generals, architects, reformers. We will never know because they were strangled before they could become anything at all. And Mehmed III, he ruled for 8 years. His reign was marked by military failures, internal unrest, and a creeping paranoia that never left him. He trusted no one, not his viziers, not his guards, not even his own sons, because he knew better than anyone what the throne demanded, and he knew that one day his son would do to his grandsons what he had done to his brothers. The cycle would continue, the blood would flow, and the empire would call it duty. Chapter 6: Mehmud's terrible invention. The massacre of 1595 was not an anomaly, it was a precedent. And Mehmed II's decision sent a clear message to every future sultan: hesitation is weakness, mercy is suicide. But the horror of that night did something else, something the dynasty hadn't anticipated. It forced them to confront a question they'd been avoiding for centuries. Is there a limit to how much blood a throne can be built on? Because Mehmud's mass execution wasn't just brutal. It was inefficient. 19 princes, 19 funerals, 19 traumatized mothers, 19 diplomatic scandals. And for what? To secure a reign that lasted less than a decade. The system was breaking under its own cruelty, so the Ottoman court began searching for alternatives. Not out of compassion, but out of pragmatism. They needed a way to neutralize rival heirs without the spectacle of mass murder, without the diplomatic backlash, without the trauma that was beginning to destabilize the palace itself. And so they refined the cafes. The cage had existed before, but after Mehmed III, it became the primary tool of succession. Instead of killing princes outright, sultans would lock them away, imprison them in luxury, keep them alive. But powerless, it seemed on the surface like progress, a more humane solution. But anyone who survived the cafes knew the truth. It was just a different kind of execution, slower, more psychological, more cruel in its subtlety, because death is final. But the cafes was eternal. Waiting princes were sealed inside at adolescence and told they might be released if the sultan died, and if they were chosen as heir. And if no one else poisoned them first, it could take decades. Some princes spent 40 years in the cafes, 40 years of isolation, surveillance, and mind-numbing monotony. They aged in those rooms. They forgot what the outside world looked like. They lost the ability to trust, to hope, to dream. And if they were finally released, if they somehow became sultan, they emerged broken. Take Mantur. He became sultan at 14. After his predecessor was deposed. He had spent years in the cafes, and when he took the throne, he was paranoid, erratic, desperate to prove himself. He tried to reform the military, to break the power of the janissaries, the elite soldiers who had grown too influential, too dangerous. But he had no allies, no experience, no understanding of how to navigate the political machine. Within 3 years, the janissaries revolted. They stormed the palace, dragged Osman from his chambers, tortured him, and then they killed him, crushing his testicles in a vice before strangling him. He was 17 years old. His crime: being too weak to control the empire he'd inherited. But how could he have been anything else? He'd spent his childhood in a cage, learning nothing except fear. This was the genius and the horror of Mehmud's system. It didn't just kill princes, it hollowed them out. So that even if they survived, even if they reached the throne, they were already ruins of what they might have been, and the empire suffered for it. Because the sultans who emerged from the cafes were end conquerors, they were end strategists, they were end the brilliant rulers who had built the empire in the first place. They were traumatized survivors clinging to power because the alternative was death. And so the empire stagnated, military campaigns, faltered, corruption spread, the bureaucracy bloated with officials who served themselves rather than the state. Meanwhile, Europe, the continent the Ottomans once dominated, was entering the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the age of exploration, and the Ottomans, they were still strangling their princes, still locking away potential, still sacrificing their future on the altar of paranoia. Historians would later call this period the beginning of the empire's decline. But it wasn't conquest or economics that doomed them, it was this: they built their throne on the corpses of their own potential, and eventually there was nothing left to build with. Chapter 7. The Empire of Silent Mourning. There are no monuments to the murdered princes, no statues, no memorials, no inscriptions commemorating their names. The Ottoman Empire erased them as efficiently as it killed them. But erasure does not mean forgetting, because the trauma of fratricide seeped into every corner of the palace, every corner of the empire, every generation that followed. The mothers who watched their sons die never recovered. Some retreated into drug-induced stupors, opium, hashish, anything to dull the memories. Others became paranoid, seeing assassins in every shadow, refusing food in case it was poison, lashing out at servants for imagined betrayals. A few became power brokers themselves, determined that if they could save their own sons, they would at least control the sons who survived. But most simply faded. They lived out their years in forgotten wings of the palace, aging invisibly, mourning silently, their grief unacknowledged, because to speak of it was to acknowledge the crime, and the crime was law. The servants too carried the weight. Many of those who worked in the imperial harem had watched princes grow from infants to boys to teenagers, only to be dragged away in the night. They'd braided the hair of children who would be strangled by dawn. They'd served meals to princes who would never eat again, and they said nothing because silence was survival. But silence has a cost. Ambassadors from Europe writing home noted a strange quality to the Ottoman court, a sense of dread, of heaviness, as if the palace itself were haunted. They speak in whispers, wrote one Venetian envoy, even in celebration. There is a shadow over them, as if they know something terrible is always about to happen. And they were right, because fratricide didn't just destroy princes, it destroyed trust. No one in the palace could afford real loyalty, not to a prince who might be executed tomorrow, not to a mother who might fall from favor, not to a sultan who might be deposed by his own guards. Every relationship was transactional, every alliance temporary, and that mistrust radiated outward. It infected the military. Generals hesitated to commit to campaigns because they didn't know if the sultan who ordered them would still be in power when they returned. It infected the bureaucracy. Viziers hoarded power because they knew that backing the wrong prince or the wrong faction could mean their own execution. It infected the people, because while the common population didn't witness the murders directly, they felt the consequences. They saw sultans who were too paranoid to govern effectively, who purged officials on suspicion rather than evidence, who launched wars to distract from internal instability. They saw an empire that, for all its grandeur, was rotting from within, and slowly, inevitably, the rot spread. By the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer expanding. It was defending. By the 18th century, it was retreating, and by the 19th century, it was known as the sick man of Europe, a once great power now crumbling under its own weight. Historians would point to many causes: military defeats, economic stagnation, the rise of European imperialism. But underneath it all was this: an empire that devoured its own future, could not sustain itself. Because every strangled prince was a lost general, a lost reformer, a lost visionary. Every traumatized sultan was a missed opportunity, and every generation that grew up under the shadow of the bowstring learned the same lesson. Survival is more important than excellence. Safety is more important than ambition. Silence is more important than truth. It was a lesson that would outlast the empire itself, and its echoes can still be heard today. Chapter 8. The Last Bloodline Gamble. By the early 1600s, the empire was running out of princes. Centuries of fratricide and the cafes had thinned the bloodline to a thread. There were no surplus heirs anymore, no backup plans, and so for the first time the Ottomans faced a new kind of crisis. What happens when the system designed to prevent instability causes it? Sultan Ahmed I came to power in 1603 at the age of 13. He was young, idealistic, and against all precedent. He refused to kill his brother Mustafa. It was a radical decision. His advisors were horrified. The law was clear. Mustafa was a threat, but Ahmed hesitated. Perhaps it was compassion, perhaps it was pragmatism. Mustafa was mentally unstable, hardly a credible rival. Or perhaps Ahmed simply couldn't bear to add another name to the dynasty's body count. Whatever the reason, Mustafa lived, and when Ahmed died suddenly in 1617, the empire faced something it hadn't experienced in centuries. Two living heirs, the throne passed to Mustafa, but he was incompetent, erratic, possibly insane. He was deposed within months. Then it went to Ahmed's son Osman II, who was murdered by the Janissaries 3 years later. Then back to Mustafa, who was deposed again, then to another of Ahmed's sons, Murad IV, a brutal, paranoid sultan, who executed tens of thousands during his reign, and nearly destroyed what remained of the dynasty's credibility. It was chaos, the very chaos fratricide was supposed to prevent. Because sparing Mustafa hadn't created stability, it had created a succession crisis that destabilized the empire for decades. The lesson was clear: mercy has consequences, but so does cruelty, and the Ottomans were trapped between the two. Future sultans tried to find a middle path. They refined the caliphate further. They controlled which princes had children. They manipulated the succession to avoid direct conflict. But the system was unsustainable by the 18th century. The empire had effectively abandoned fratricide. The caliphate remained, but executions became rare, not because the Ottomans had grown more humane, but because the dynasty was too fragile to risk losing any more heirs. And so the final generation of Ottoman princes lived in a strange limbo. Not free, not dead, just waiting for an empire that was already dying, waiting for a throne that no longer held the power it once did. And when the empire finally collapsed in 1922, when the last sultan was deposed and the caliphate dissolved, those final princes were scattered. Some fled to Europe, some lived in exile, some faded into obscurity, and the dynasty that had once ruled 3 continents, that had built palaces and conquered cities, and written its name across history, ended not with a war, but with a whisper, because the empire had spent so long killing its future that when the end came, there was nothing left to fight for. No visionary leader, no unified cause, no heir strong enough to reclaim what had been lost, just the ghosts of 1,000 strangled princes, and the unshakable knowledge that the throne they died for had never been worth the cost. Chapter 9 echoes in the present. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but the logic that sustained it, that justified fratricide, that built power on fear, that sacrificed the future for the present, that logic is not. We see it in regimes that purge potential rivals before they can rise, in families where inheritance is a battlefield, in systems where loyalty is measured not by merit but by submission. The names change, the geography shifts, but the pattern remains. Power that cannot tolerate competition will eventually devour itself. The Ottoman princes were not villains, they were victims of a system that valued control over potential, fear over trust, survival over legacy. And the sultans who ordered their deaths were not monsters, they were men trapped by a doctrine they inherited and a fear they could not escape. But the tragedy is this: it didn't have to be this way. There were alternatives: exile, power-sharing, federalism systems that other empires used imperfectly, yes, but without the ritual slaughter of their own heirs. The Ottomans chose differently. They chose the bowstring, and in doing so they wrote a dark lesson into history. An empire that fears its own blood will drown in it. The palaces still stand topkapi with its latticed screens and silent courtyards is now a museum. Tourists walk through the rooms where princes were strangled. They take photos of the gardens where mothers wept, but the weight of what happened there lingers. Because history is not just dates and battles and treaties, it is the accumulated grief of people who lived under systems They could not change, and it is a warning that power unchecked, paranoia unchallenged, and cruelty normalized will always turn inward. The Ottoman dynasty believed that by killing its sons it would live forever. Instead, it ensured that when the end came, there would be no one left to mourn it. And so we remember them now, the princes whose names were erased, the mothers whose cries were silenced, the empire that built its throne on bones and wondered why it crumbled. We remember them not as a spectacle, but as a reminder that the greatest threat to any civilization is not the enemy at the gate. It is the violence we justify in the name of order, the cruelty we normalize in the name of survival, and the future we strangle in the name of holding on to the past.